Okay, so we're recording now. Thank you everyone who is here live at the Peer Coach Conversation and those that are watching after. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Jessica and I work in the School of Education as the coordinator of first year experience. And these Peer Coach Conversations are just an opportunity to give you guys some additional resources as you're heading out into the field and starting your journey in the Baylor School of Education, or you're just a Baylor student and you really are interested in some of these topics. So about twice a semester, we'll host these where two of our peer coaches are going to kind of tag team and teach us, and it'll be a time of discussion and reflection. So we've got Emily and Natalie who are going to lead us on celebrating diversity in the classroom. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves a little bit more, and they're going to take it away from here.
All right, well, my name is Emily Hale. I'm a junior all-level special ed major. And that's a little bit about me. Natalie.
Yeah. I'm Natalie. I'm also a junior all-level special ed major. And Emily and I just thought that our topic for today's peer coach conversation was really important to us, but also something really important to talk about for other students who may not have had the same experiences or who just want to learn more about having a culturally relevant classroom.
Yep.
I'm sorry, do I share now? Sorry. Okay. Let's see. All right, so cultural diversity in the classroom. So cultural diversity, is defined in one of our IRIS modules or IRIS centers as teachers will have students who display different ways of learning, behaving, communicating, and interacting with others. And then this is just kind of the breakdown of what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about issues, its effects, possible solutions, and then resources that you can use. So first, discussion. What are issues in today's school system that stem from the civil rights era? If anyone would like to participate. Okay, that's fine. I can move it on. So we have our foundation. So while there have been recent shifts in structure, minority groups have been affected negatively by American school systems since their conception. So these are just a couple of examples of how certain minority groups have been treated in American school systems. So for example, Native Americans were forced to attend American schools in an effort to assimilate them to Western culture. So they were kind of forced to drop their religious and cultural elements and principles. Chinese Americans were shut out from American schools, but eventually allowed to attend Chinese-only schools. And we'll kind of see that as a pattern with different minority groups where they're not allowed to attend typical schools, but are kind of forced to create their own school systems. With Latin Americans, it happened as well. They were eventually allowed to attend Latino-only schools. The difference between Latin Americans and the other minority groups that are listed was that eventually Latin Americans were forced to be, were found to be under the white ethnicity. So Latin Americans kind of got the better end out of these four particular groups towards the end, just because they were classified as better than other groups. And then we have Black Americans, where it was initially illegal for them to learn how to read or write from the Jim Crow era and prior. And they were eventually able to attend all Black schools, but then they were eventually put into segregated schools. So the history. So we have a lot of things that happened around the 1960s with the civil rights movement. So first is the Brown versus Board of Education case. Emily, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So that was back in 1952, one of the most significant court cases that impacted education. So it said they established racial segregation in public schools as unconstitutional. So even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality, which most of the time they really weren't, they said that was unconstitutional. So that was a big moment in the history of education. Why is it still relevant today? Honestly, I mean, like I said, it was so influential that we still carry over as, I lost my words. But yes, we don't segregate schools anymore. We still push for that equal education no matter race, ethnicity, and such. Another really important thing was the achievement gap. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but the discrepancies between white students and POC students, their performance is just so big, the difference. The nation's report card, I tagged that down there. So if you go to their website, you can plug in your state, Texas, and you can compare white students to Black, Hispanic, Asian, like all the different races and ethnicities. You can compare them to each other, and it shows you very clearly on a graph how that achievement gap, how big it is. And I think that's important for us to recognize that there is that gap and eventually find ways, what can we do about it? Yes.
Sorry. And now we have this portion where it's after Brown v. Board. So here we have two different paintings. Pictures. But the first is a painting of Ruby Bridges. And this was in 1960 in New Orleans. So these two images kind of tell the same story, where Black students are finally allowed to go to white schools, but are met with a lot of public outrage. So as you can see here, she's kind of being protected as she walks because she is in a state of or in a place where she could be physically harmed. We can see that there's like tomatoes being thrown at her. With the Little Rock Nine, it was really the same situation. And what's kind of crazy is that this, I believe, was in 1954. So they would have like a 6-year difference, but you can see that there's still a lot of public outrage despite the time gap. Yeah.
And then I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Freedom School. So traditionally, it's rooted in the Mississippi Freedom School summer project in 1964. And the CDF, the Children's Defense Fund Freedom School program, historically and still continues today to be a part of the Black Community Crusade for Children. So Baylor actually hosted a Freedom School summer 2019. Yes, not this past year, COVID. But yeah, so it's a 6-week program for summer literacy and cultural enrichment. We served at an elementary school, so my kids were in kindergarten, and then we also partnered with a middle school. And really, it's culturally relevant teaching. So really with my kids, we found, or the CDF Freedom School, they provided us with books with kids in those stories who looked like the kids in my classroom. So they could identify with people who look like them and then eventually develop that love for reading. And because it is focused on literacy, but also societal and cultural things going on around them that even at the age of 6, they need to be aware of. Yep.
All right, and now we're going to talk about the effects of the issues and how those can be seen today. So here we have just a couple of examples. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is language. So language and curriculum kind of go hand in hand because a lot of time the language that you use in your classroom is given to you with your curriculum. And here we just wanted to talk about the importance of what you're teaching, what you're selecting, if you have freedom to select different resources or materials or forms of media during your lessons, and how you teach it. So just an example of that is social studies, elementary, middle school, high school. Everyone learns about the issue of slavery and how that was a very dark and yet crucial time in American history. And there was an article that I read where a teacher began to, instead of using the word slaves, she would use the term enslaved people. And so that's just like a really small difference that you can use to make a, yes, sorry, that's a small change that you can make that can still tell a bigger story. Because I feel like once you hear a word so often, you get kind of desensitized to it. So in elementary school, we're taught about slavery and we hear slaves often, often, often. So once we get to high school, we might not think about it as critically as we would if we were to use a different term like enslaved people, because that kind of humanizes or it makes students understand how important the issue was, because again, people might become kind of desensitized to the way a certain thing is being taught. So using different languages, or sorry, using different phrases or terms to describe a certain event might be able to help your students think about something in a different way. Another side effect of our issue is lower funded schools. So as we all learn in social issues, public schools get their funding based off of the taxes from local property values. So what studies have found is that communities that have a very large minority population tend to be lower income, tend to be lower income. So the houses that might be around a certain school might have less resources than a school near an area with higher property values. And so that has just kind of shown to be harmful for a lot of people. I'm sure Baylor students that have had experience working in different schools around Waco have kind of been able to tell how their education has been different from their current students' education. So that's just one example. Another thing is the percentage of minority students that pursue higher education. Emily, could you share on that for a second?
So I pulled up the statistic. The most recent one we have is 2017, so not too long ago, but it said the population was 61% white, 18% Hispanic, 12.3% Black, 5.7% Asian, 1.9% one or more race, 0.7% American Indian or Alaskan Native, and 0.3% Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. So with 61% being white, that means only 39% are POC students.
Right. And then one other side effect that we might face in public, or really any school in America, are teachers with implicit biases. So basically what that means is that a teacher may have a bias about a certain group of people or students that they may not even realize that they have. Going back to when we were talking about Ruby Ridges or the Little Rock Nine, when we think about those ideas or concepts or places in history, we think of them as kind of far away, but it really wasn't. Like, that's only like 40 years before some of us were born, you know, like that's still such a recent time in history. So, you know, some people who are in admin or who are teachers now may have grown up living in that time where people have been more hateful to different groups. And that's not to say that that's their fault, because it's not, you know, it's not like one person has control over everyone else. But if, you know, there were people that were brought up in that environment, they might have some biases that they may not realize that they have, and it may be reflected in how they treat their students. Ooh, sorry. And so another issue here are microaggressions. So here we have a quote from Kevin et al., where he says, "Microaggressions are defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias toward historically marginalized groups. The difference between microaggressions and overt discrimination or microaggressions is that people who commit microaggressions might not even be aware of them." So a couple of examples that we put down there were like, your accent is so good, or how long did it take you to learn English? A lot of times people may have assumptions of a person based off of their ethnic group. And it's really important for us as teachers to make sure that our students know that we shouldn't really be making assumptions of anyone and that we should really try to learn more about their stories rather than just kind of write our own for everyone else. And something that a lot of people may not realize is that microaggressions can be really harmful. And it's so crazy because, again, a lot of times people who are making microaggressions don't even realize that what they're saying is harmful. So they could be just, going around and like saying things that might not be as kind or as polite as they think to others. So an example of this is over the summer, there was a group of Baylor students that aren't affiliated with Baylor, like officially, that created an Instagram account called Dear Baylor. And here students would highlight instances of different forms of mistreatment, whether it be like sexual harassment or sexism, but a big topic was microaggressions or like experiences that they have had as a student at Baylor, whether it be from other students or professors. And I just feel like that's a really good resource if you don't really know what microaggressions are, or if you want to learn more about how that might look on just like an everyday scale or basis, like how it happens at Baylor. That would be a really good tool to use. So discussion question. This is just something that you can answer. You might be able to just think about. What do you think minority students struggle with today?
One thing that, if I could say something, is like the idea of being in higher education, like, and also struggling and comparing themselves to their peers, where they sometimes fail to realize that the fact that they're there is an achievement in itself, and that, because, sorry, like this is all sociology because this is what I study, that they often struggle with imposter syndrome, where like they deserve that, they think that they don't deserve to be there, or that they're just like less than everyone else, or like that they're, I guess, an imposter. And I feel like that's a big struggle that is not talked about enough.
I completely agree with you. I'm actually I'm a part of the Baylor McNair program, and it's actually a program here at Baylor that's dedicated to helping minority students, underrepresented students of underrepresented populations, as well as first-gen students, and helping them to obtain their PhD, because that is, I think it was Emily saying earlier about the percentage of POC in higher ed students, and it's definitely like something that needs to be pushed forward. And the fact that there is not that much of a representation in especially like from a professor standpoint in higher ed, I can definitely see a lot of that, where most of my most of my friends professors mostly have been taught by white males. And while we do have a couple female professors or Hispanic professors, it's just not that rich of a diversity that like could be met, yeah.
I feel like another issue in itself that I've encountered is, for example, in my field of sociology, I want to kind of learn more about the sociology of those that are like me. So like, I want to read over like education and like how government policies affect us and what that effect has on the individual and like each like demographic. And it's super understudied. And I feel like part of the issue is that for the longest time, all of that research was done by white men. So if they didn't see it, they wouldn't research it. So sometimes it's on those in that demographic to bring up those issues in order for them to be studied. But since like the removal of segregation has been so recent, it's very much like a slow process to get those individuals into the positions where they can be conducting that research and like proposing that kind of research. And also it has to do with like the like gaining wealth, and like that in itself is just like a very slow process.
Yeah, Denise, that's such a valuable perspective. Thanks for sharing. I think of my like hometown where I grew up, and I don't know that I really noticed it until like moving away from it, but there was a very clear divide between like the upper white middle class area and then like the lower income. I grew up in Southern California, so a huge Hispanic population, and that like when you're talking about the lower funded schools, Natalie, I thought of this where literally like there was a line, like a street that ran through my hometown, and below it, like that was where a lot of the Hispanic population was, and like the schools were in lower income neighborhoods, so they weren't as well funded and things like that. And I think of how those issues start so young and then just trickle up the line. And so like really powerful stuff of how you see discrimination and things like that play at all levels of education.
Yeah, I grew up in Plano, and they really only offered the bilingual option for students on the east side, which is like the more lower income area. So even if a student were to live in like the west side, like the higher income area, if they weren't native English speakers, they would still be sent to the east side with like not necessarily as much funding for resources. So that's like, yeah, another example of how they might be struggling today because maybe they're not getting the resources that they need at a school that they're placed in. And then something else that we didn't really talk about that Denise kind of brought up was representation. I think it's really important for especially administrations to have kind of a diverse group because, for example, ESL, I don't think it would be fully fair for someone who doesn't have a background in like non-native English speakers or for them to like make decisions that can have really big implications for students on all levels. You know, it could be grades, it could be what media they're using during their lessons, it could be what they're being taught. Like I just feel like we should have a more inclusive and diverse group of people that are making decisions like that can have effects on students, you know, through their lifetime.
Yeah, I think building on that, especially looking at it from an elementary perspective, you also want to think like socially, are your students feeling accepted in the classroom? Is that the type of culture that you've created or your students have learned from parents or from home? And then once you recognize that, what are you as a teacher going to do to change that?
Awesome. So now we're going to move towards solutions. So what do you think that cultural diversity in the classroom looks like? So like what are examples that you can think of that teachers could use in their classrooms to build a more culturally inclusive environment?
I definitely, I got to sneak in on a couple of Emily's classes at Freedom School last year. So I was honestly like blown away by the books they were reading, like, and just kind of, because from what I remember going to the library and reading books, like, if I really think about it, I can't think of one, I can't think of too many books that we read growing up whenever we went to go to the library and have public reading time. I can't think of anyone that kind of represented some sort of person of color. And just seeing those books, like I can't remember some of the exact ones. Emily probably remembers better than me, but like some like why one was about someone getting shot, right? Wasn't someone was about
There was one that covered police brutality.
Yes.
Yeah, it's something happened in our town.
Yes. And like that, I was like, I wasn't even thinking about that stuff whenever I was little, but I probably like, it probably should have been brought up so that like I wouldn't be having those ugly conversations without having the proper knowledge of it. So it's like kind of in a gentle and very loving way, preparing someone for kind of the ugly facts that are gonna happen. Unless, that they need to change as well. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I remember before, so we would make the lesson plans the week before, and they would tell us what books we were going to read. And they're like, yeah, go ahead and read this book and then make the lesson. And I remember reading it. I was like, I'm teaching 6-year-olds who were, almost all of them were Black, about police brutality. And it was a very emotional thing for me, because I was like, this is a big problem. How do I tell 6-year-olds about this? And it was through the material, through the book, through what Freedom School provided, like, follow these points specifically, because you don't want to say the wrong thing and have the students go down like a whole other path. Like, you want to be as clear but still as simple as possible, definitely if you're teaching that lower age group, but then continuing those discussions throughout higher elementary, middle, high school. And I mean, like we're doing here now, having those discussions are just so important.
I feel like not only having those discussions and like having those difficult conversations, but also representation in that you're more than that. Like these things do happen, but also stories where it is like, it does incorporate their identity, like racially or like whatever culturally, that kind of puts them in like a good light. Like, for example, like a book about a girl. I think there's like TV shows now. There's been much more like representation, but not as in like a token minority kind of way.
Right.
Like, it's not
like
a big
very
deal
easily.
if they're,
What's up?
sorry. I was gonna say, it's like, it's not a big deal if, like, it's not the first thing that's noticed that someone's Black or that someone's Hispanic. Like, it's just kind of like, oh, that's Emily Hale, or that's Denise, or that's Natalie. You're like, it's like just a normal, it's not their identity. It's rather just a descriptor.
Yeah, just their circumstance.
Yeah.
That I feel like you could very easily fall into like tokenism, where like, oh, like you as a Black person, you must experience all of these things, where that's not their whole identity. They're, for example, like, I am my friend Amaya. Like, she's like, I am Amaya. I like books. I like Harry Potter. It's not, that's part of the things that happen, but not all of it. And I feel like that's important.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Nice. Those are really good points. So Emily's going to talk a little bit about culturally relevant teaching.
Okay, so culturally relevant teaching was defined by Gloria Ladson-Billings, who wrote one of the books we highly recommend in our resources. So she called it a form of teaching that calls for engaging learners whose experiences and cultures are traditionally excluded from mainstream settings. But then this is done by using that cultural knowledge, the prior experiences, performance styles, and just their different styles from their ethnically diverse students. You're using all of their background knowledge to make the learning encounters more relevant to them and overall more effective, therefore closing that achievement gap.
And then why should I celebrate cultural diversity in my classroom? I feel like a lot of times people think that children are like too young, or they don't really know what's going on. But really, children begin engaging in conversations about race without even knowing it, and like a lot sooner than you might think about it. Like, I remember comparing skin colors with my friends in kindergarten. You know, so we have this chart that kind of breaks down how children of different ages begin to kind of conceptualize race. So at birth, babies look equally at faces of all races. At 3 months, babies look more at faces that match the race of their caregivers. At 1 year, children as young as 2 years use race to reason about people's behaviors. By 30 months, most children use race to choose playmates. Expressions of racial prejudice often peak at ages 4 and 5. By 5, Black and Latinx children in research settings show no preference toward their own groups compared to whites. White children at this age remain strongly biased in favor of whiteness. By kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes that adults in our culture hold. They have already learned to associate some groups with higher status than others. And 6 on, explicit conversations with 5 to 7-year-olds about interracial friendship can dramatically improve their racial attitudes in as little as a single week. So these are just like really small things that we can do that can change their outlooks or their perspectives on different people. And so we just have this little point on the side that says kids have conversations about race earlier than you may think. They may not fully understand what they are saying, but they need your help understanding what is appropriate or inappropriate in the classroom, because a lot of times kids may demonstrate some microaggressions coming from implicit biases that they might not even know about. Like I mentioned earlier to Jessica and Emily, I grew up here in Texas. My dad is from Texas, so he grew up an English speaker. And my mom did not. She grew up in Mexico. So my mom would come and visit me, and she was on the PTA, and then the kids would always kind of be like, Natalie, like your mom doesn't speak English. Like that's kind of weird. Or they just like point out things that they recognized where I was like different from them with my mom. But they weren't coming at me for that in like any kind of like malintent. They were just kind of pointing something out because that's what kids do. So I think it's really important for you as a teacher to listen to the conversations that your children are having, and just kind of making sure that they're not really making assumptions or like putting labels like weird on people just because they're different. And then we have, why is culturally relevant teaching important? So I think Emily and I can both kind of talk about this, but I wanted to mention that there actually have been studies that have been conducted, and which I think are mentioned in the ARIS module that we'll mention a little bit later, that basically say that children who engage in culturally relevant teaching have higher senses of empathy, of understanding. They have a greater ability to put themselves in other people's shoes. But they also a lot of times become a lot more confident because they're normally in culturally relevant environments are like a lot more comfortable because you have kind of like broken down these walls that might be up in other scenarios. So children might feel comfortable, more comfortable engaging in your classroom than they might somewhere else.
Yeah, for sure. You're really empowering your students with this knowledge and making your POC students feel valued, feel heard and recognized, as well as educating your white students about what different cultures look like. Another thing, it really does support social emotional learning to that knowledge. I mean, you're really building a well-rounded student when you expose them to all these different cultures. Yeah. And then we listed some tips for teachers. We talked about taking like a cultural inventory, so sending that sheet home with your student at the beginning of the year. Parents, family, they fill this out, and that way it really gets you able to have the background on your student, know the best ways to communicate with their parents, and you could also use this as a resource if you want to include them later on in the year presenting things that represent their own culture. Involve the families, involve them when students have that firsthand experience with someone, because it's one thing to read it in a book, but if there's someone from that culture right there in front of them telling them how it is, it's completely different. I think another thing we suggest is learning your own biases. So really reflecting on that yourself. Are there any biases you hold? Because overall that will affect your students if you don't recognize those and then work to dismantle them. I mean, that's really going to affect your students. We also said say their names. So that is really important. I read an article not too long ago about it, but I know it's common when you see mostly Black students with names that you can't pronounce or sound different, unusual. Some people won't use those nice words, but you know, and it's like, oh, Jaquan, how do you say your name? Like that kind of stuff you hear with people making fun of these names that are typically Black names. This article I was reading was saying how a long time ago, back with slavery, that Black people wanted to differentiate themselves from the white culture and these white mainstream names that were forced on them. So that's why they created these unique names. And really, they should be recognized and celebrated. It's not something they should make fun of. And if you see your students making fun of another student's name, it's a conversation you should have with them. Another thing we suggested was using children's resources. So sometimes when you're learning about a cultural element that's unfamiliar, you haven't heard of, you don't really understand, using some of the children's resources really simplifies it for you. And they're easy to use in your subject. Like, it also helps you recognize it from a child's perspective. And then, of course, like growing that knowledge from there.
Right. And then just back on the cultural inventory, when we were talking about resource inventory, this is also kind of like, let's say you have a career day coming up and you know that one of your POC students has a family member that's in that field. Inviting them over to talk to your classroom really does help with that representation, because your students can be like, oh, hey, like I can be a doctor, or I can be an engineer, so that might be helpful for them, just to see people who look like them achieving in something that they're interested in. And then also with this say their names, a lot of times our students might have like Americanized names. So I feel like it's really important for you to try to make an effort to say their name how it is intended, just because, again, that's how it's intended. And it might make them feel more comfortable around you, just because they know that you're trying to make them, be seen and feel included in your classroom. Then we have easy ways to celebrate diversity. So you can choose your visuals. So selecting visuals and media that represent a diverse group of people, which also goes back to representation. Using inclusive language, so sending notes home in different languages, the languages of your students' families. And teaching your students words, phrases, or gestures from different cultures in your daily routine. So this is just something really simple. You could be teaching a lesson and be like, hey, does everyone understand, or does no one understand? That's just like an easy way for them to start using ASL. Or if they need help, you could teach them the word for help in a different language. For example, in Spanish, it's ayuda. So you can just try to easily sprinkle in some different words or phrases or gestures from different cultures, just so they're just like that little bit more aware. And having a positive attitude. If you're introducing a cultural concept or element that your students are unfamiliar with, you can describe it in a really positive way with a really positive attitude, and avoid using words that can be damaging, like weird or unusual, I don't know. But an example of that, for example, Dia de los Muertos is coming up. And in that, families will leave food and gifts for people that they have lost. And to some people, especially in like American cultures where that really isn't a thing, aside from like flowers, they may be like, that's really weird. Like, why are you bringing food to somebody who isn't even present anymore? But if you were to say, and on this day, they get all of their things together and they make sure that they bring everything that someone loved and they give it to them as a gift, so that way they can enjoy it even if they're not all together. Like just using a more positive attitude can make your students have a more positive outlook on different cultures and elements. And then another way is to involve your families. And this kind of goes also back to the resource inventory with your cultural interest inventory, but involving your students' families in a way that they feel comfortable contributing. And so then we just have a really short clip, and we don't really need to use the audio, but here a parent wanted to come and read to a classroom, but they couldn't read in English. Can everyone see my screen? Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. So a teacher invited them to read in their language. So then this parent got to read to her daughter's classroom, and not even in English. She just got to read a story to them in her native language. And I feel like that's like a really easy step that you can take to make your parents feel involved even and feel welcomed and celebrated. And I mean, even if you're just looking at the little girl, like she's so excited that her mom is reading and all of the students are still paying attention, even though they may not know what she's saying. So that's a really, really awesome way that you can do that. And now we have our resources. So here are resources that you can utilize with your students. So you can use digital or public libraries that may have pre-selected book lists that cover certain themes or celebrations like Black History Month. And it'll include material created by POC artists and authors with various backgrounds. I know Epic has like a book list in a blog where they uploaded and selected and gave teachers lesson ideas for Hispanic Heritage Month. So that can be a really valuable resource for you or your students. Another one is Bookmarks on Netflix. This is a new series that they started this past month where Black celebrities and artists read children's books by Black authors to spark meaningful conversations about empathy, equality, justice, self-love, and anti-racism. And another resource that you can use with your students is have them connect with someone that isn't in the same area, and that way they can learn from other children about different cultures and about different backgrounds.
And then here we just listed some resources for you. So especially at Baylor, Natalie and I both took social issues in education. My professor, Dr. Scott, and hers, Dr. McGill, really great resources. Feel free to reach out to them anytime. I love both of them. We also recommend talking to the special advisor to the president for equity and campus engagement. That's Malcolm Foley. Also the Baylor Multicultural Affairs, the LRC, because you School of Ed people know the LRC has so many different resources, and you check out books that about culturally relevant teaching, getting a social studies lesson from it, reading children's books with diverse characters or backgrounds, or of course, Jessica James, or us as your peer coaches, or even your POC peers. Then we also listed some books that we've read from our social issues classes, and then some more. So like The Shame of the Nation by Jonathan Cazal, I Wish My Teacher Knew, How One Question Can Change Everything for Our Kids by Kyle Schwartz, an Introduction to Multicultural Education by James A. Banks, and then the Iris Center module is also listed below.
Yeah, and the Iris Center module is really interesting because it's a module where you can learn about culturally relevant teaching, but also put yourself in like a teacher's position for this section. So you can kind of experiment with like different methods that you might use when you're implementing CRT. And then we have a couple of anti-racism resources. Emily?
Oh yeah, this was actually taken from what was it, the multicultural page on Baylor's website? Yes, so we screenshotted these for you. There's books, movies, podcasts, I mean, all great resources to use. And you can see the link there if you want to look at that later, but highly recommended.
And then we just have this ending quote where if we don't stand up for children, then we don't stand for much, by Marian Wright Edelman.
Yeah, she was one of the Children's Defense Fund, so the Freedom School, one of the founders and president. She is a queen. I have that quote on a t-shirt too. Like, I love it. Okay, and then we have a Q&A session.
If you have any questions. If not, that's okay too.
I think one thing I wanted to add that I thought of this while we were presenting was, you know, you hear people say, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. But I was talking to Dr. Scott one time, and she was like, I want you to see I want you to see that about me. It's something that I strongly identify with. It's not something you should be blinded to. You should be able to recognize this as my identity and something I'm proud of. So I think teachers who say they're colorblind or, oh, I don't see race, I mean, that can be very detrimental.
I completely agree with that. I actually read some stuff. I'm sociology, a race and ethnicity class this semester, and yes, I love it. It's so much reading. I feel like I'm
With Dr. Park?
yes. Oh, I love him. But yeah, we're so one of the readings that we had was on they called it colorblind racism, the fact that you are using being colorblind as an excuse to not have to deal with the issues that people of color do experience. So rather than saying yes, this is a problem and I stand with you, you're saying, oh, well, I don't see the problem. So that's, yeah, I completely agree with that, Emily.
We love Dr. Park. I actually did not have the chance to take that class with him. I actually took it with a doctoral student.
Okay, yeah.
So, which really just says something about the sociology department, its needs for professors. I actually took it with the doctoral student who ended up being like a white male. And so when we got to the part where we were talking about like Hispanic people, he kind of like pulled me apart because I had already had a class with him. So we were like personable. He was like, hey, I really would like your input on like how I can better like teach this. Cause like, I don't want it just to be like, oh, like hearing it from like this white man. I kind of want to see your perspective, what things you find to be important, what certain things I don't understand. He couldn't really understand the concept of Latinx.
Oh yeah.
Because it's very complicated and there's a lot of discussion even within the Hispanic community on like who uses it, who doesn't. Is that kind of gentrifying the language? Oh, like, oh, you're Latinx, but the Spanish itself is very gendered. Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of that conversation.
Really interesting. Natalie and Emily, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty good.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing, and for our guests for sharing and participating too. These are such important conversations that I hope that we continue to have. If you are interested in getting more plugged in with some resources, even if you are not a student of color, the Multicultural Affairs Office is a great place to start. They've got some really cool events, or just even if you follow them on social media, some cool conversations they have. It's just important that we can learn from each other and continue to be in dialogue and learn from other experiences so we can celebrate each other and build really inclusive classroom spaces for our future students. So thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up with myself or Emily or Natalie, and we would be happy to talk further about that.